Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Outlaw Science. Locke's Palimpsest. Forget this date. 1066. 1066 is the one date the English are most likely to remember and, for some, the date they most want to forget. With resistance mercilessly crushed and areas of the north burned and starved into submission, the Norman conquest was the genocidal founding of British imperial order. For 300 years afterwards, the ruling caste spoke French over a Germanic-speaking populace. During this period, representative Anglo-Saxon identity on a political level was erased, and it was a good thing. But then the Norman conquest just sort of went away. Somehow, when this dramatic incident in the childhood of the English-speaking world is opened to the discoveries of Darwinian evolution, the result is nothing less than revolution. The merciless repression of the revolts and the genocidal harrying of the North that starved and butchered part of the population into submission are explicable as genetically adaptive behaviors. Kin selection is requisite for understanding the British order established by the conquest, class segregation and discrimination against native Anglo-Saxons in their own country, and its perpetuation over the centuries that followed. Above all, the extreme logic of the selfish gene clarifies the nature of the Norman destruction of the native Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. Is it so hard to understand why people have been resistant to applying Darwin's understanding of the human to the most famous date in his own country's history? The conquest was an Anglo-Saxon national catastrophe. The trauma of defeat, conquest, submission, and collaboration left scars within the Anglo-Saxon psyche that have evolved to define political modernity in the English-speaking world and beyond. Only when one attempts to face the brutal experience of conquest and its aftermath, beyond the abstracted statistics, can one appreciate why the issue of the Normans was selectively repressed, evaded, and forgotten. We would derive from the conqueror, said English jurist and politician Sir Edward Coke, 1552–1634, as little as we could. 1385. In the 19th century, Ernest Jones in Notes to the People could find reason to treat the Norman land robbery with little seriousness, for the people had become repossessed of the land in the Civil Wars. 1386. Yet this argument for dismissing the impact the conquest actually demonstrates its decisive historical importance. That understanding of the English Civil War, 1642–51, demonstrates the Norman impact in altering the entire long-term trajectory of Anglo-American history. The Norman land robbery could be partially forgotten because a reasonable amount of representative democracy, along with the reasonable preservation of the old conqueror class, lead to the compromises of 1688. Yet it took revolution and reform to diffuse the internal kinship-based tensions. It took the evolution of an alternate solution of individual liberty, an alternative to civil war, which shaped the entire moderate, semi-democratic character of the English-speaking world. Only then could the Norman yoke be dismissed and forgotten. Forgetting the knowledge of that usurpation was a political necessity for those who wanted to conserve order against disturbers of the peace. The Civil War had already demonstrated the alternative. Part of the Jeffersonian liberty won by the American Revolution was the liberty to forget the whole sordid affair of the conquest. This freedom became the promise of the revolutionary victory. If man is free to pursue his happiness, and happiness consists of forgetting one's past defeats, which one is powerless to change anyway, then one can see the rationality of forgetting the Normans, which, after all, was just another way of dethroning the Normans of their place in history. After all, which was more conducive to Anglo-Saxon self-esteem, the view that they are a defeated people who accepted defeat for hundreds of years and only centuries later mustered the strength and courage to engage in tribal warfare to rectifying the situation, or the view they are the avant-garde of all humanity, leading the banner of liberty, a model for all which will one day conquer and liberate the entire globe. The basic reasons why the harsh realities underlying liberty would be suppressed or avoided are common sense. Against that ugly past, revolution carried the hope of starting over. In the beginning, All the world was America, wrote John Locke. Unlike French revolutionaries, English settlers could escape to the tabula rasa of America like an imagined state of nature. Before the corruption of the Norman conquest, it would be the place where Anglo-Saxons could reclaim a paradise lost. There were no Norman castles in America. There were certain slave owners in the South, but we can forget the whole episode along with the old Norman castles. Without persistent reminders of old world tyranny, one could put the past behind and begin the world anew. Could the gloriousness of the revolution outshine the ancient memory of Anglo-Saxon defeat? Perhaps the blinding light of the vision of the city on a hill has left its historic background in relative darkness. While English historian Christopher Hill uncovered ideas of a Norman yoke during the English Civil War period, his Marxism allowed him to dismiss these discoveries. This, as Gerald Newman observed in The Rise of English Nationalism, is but further testimony to the extraordinary blind spot that exists in English historiography on this subject, for of course the theory of the Norman yoke is the theory of the English nation. 1387. One of the most radical advocates of the theory of the Norman yoke was Englishman Gerard Winstanley, a leader of the radical Puritan sect called the Diggers. He wanted victory in the English Civil War to be followed by laws reformed and redone in English, rather than French. He wanted to alter the kingly principles of the old laws, for even if commoners could read them, they would rather increase our sorrow by our knowledge of our bondage. 1388. Thomas Jefferson's egalitarian reforms evolved out of the same radicalist genealogy of erasing the old, kingly principles. Perhaps, like Winstanley, he felt an increase in happiness with a decrease in knowledge of that ancient bondage. But what could possibly serve as a better reminder of the ancient Anglo-Saxon bondage than the existence of slavery in the United States? Southern slavery is a truly extraordinary blind spot in American history, and I will attempt here to shine some meta-enlightenment upon it. To do so is equivalent to furnishing a socio-biological analysis of Anglo-American history. Without this self-enlightenment, America is living in a perpetual dark age, unable to understand either itself or anyone else. To liberate oneself from this great tradition of forgetting to take step towards not mocking the Enlightenment principles on which it was founded. To end this barbaric state of self-ignorance, and to civilize civilization with an attempt at rational self-knowledge, is only a fulfillment of the original aspirations of the Enlightenment. This partly unconscious suppression of the past shaped the American vision of the future. Modernity is a forward-looking movement because it is a reactionary movement, a reaction against the past, a revulsion against fathoming the full implications of a specific historical misfortune called the Norman Conquest. A psychologically diagnosis reveals that this blind spot originated in exactly what modernity characteristically attempts to cure: male pride. In fact, the repression of the Norman consequence has turned out to be the greatest modern victory of male pride, covertly dominating modernity. In short, the Norman conquest is also the Anglo-Saxon subjugation. Not to be outdone by their former masters, the Anglo-Saxons themselves have often helped uphold the official government version of what happened. For Americans especially, to carry the torch of this long and noble tradition of repression is to further perpetuate the victory of a primal Anglo-Saxon male pride that refuses to see in itself a conquered people and reinterprets the world accordingly. The state of degradation that the defeated Anglo-Saxons were reduced to is revealed in the way they have collaborated to cover it up. Unable to fully accept their national defeat, and unable to fully erase it, they have helped to construct the story of the legitimacy of the conquest as a way of licking their wounds. In the posture of submission, they capitulated to the notion that they wanted to be conquered, they wanted to be ruled by foreigners, and they wanted their own language and culture to be contemptuously dismissed in their very own country. It stands to reason that even the genocide of 1069-70 could not delegitimize William's rule. After all, how else could these foreigners, who identified themselves with French place names, claim their rightful entitlement to Anglo-Saxon land, Anglo-Saxon labor, and Anglo-Saxon lives? In every respect, there is simply no way that they could not be collaborators. Yet within a strict Puritan reinterpretation of the conquest, One is supposed to believe that Anglo-Saxons really didn't want a truly political morality in the first place. One is supposed to believe that rejecting the conqueror's way of life doesn't have something to do with the fact of being conquered. This is all just another variation of the great Anglo-Saxon theme of denial of the conquest and denial of defeat. If it were simply the denial that this people was traumatized by a great national tragedy in the late childhood of their nation, it would be one thing. However, the more serious and relevant denial is that their distinctive form of government, rights, democracy, equality, individualism, is inseparable from the consequences of the conquest. Anglo-Saxon liberalism actually evolved out of failure to fully mend and recover from the consequences of the conquest. Whatever advantages the Norman bequeathed to England as a country, over the long term, all the king's men could not put this nation back together again. Take, for example, the paradox of Anglo-Saxon national individual liberty. One of the revolutionary principles of modernity is the demand that people be treated as individuals, not as members of a race or nation. Yet if the Anglo-Saxons were construed in nationalistic terms, one might conclude that the Norman conquest permanently deformed and disfigured them, and that individualism itself represents the permanent failure to fully regenerate as an ethnic nation. Individualism is correlated with the denial that Normans penetrated and violated kinship-preserving boundaries, and the denial that the integrity of these boundaries were once valued. Moral justifications are useful as the most potent means of bolstering the individual standpoint and engendering its independence from its historic, ethnic origins. The primary structural characteristic of this degeneration is Anglo-Saxon alienation from the political, expressed in the enduring anti-Norman characteristics of fear, skepticism, and distrust of strong, centralized government. Even as democracy formally and nominally represents a technical re-emergence, the reason that repression of the consequences of 1066 was so successful is that both sides had an interest in repressing it. The Norman class establishment had an interest in de-emphasizing anything that questioned the legitimacy of certain natural lords of England. The Anglo-Saxons had an ethnic interest in obscuring the Norman conquest, because Anglo-Saxon democracy can be interpreted as a Norman victory in the sense that they ultimately learned their place as an aristocratic people. They learned to believe that they are by nature not the best people. They came to believe that they are not fully political beings, a hallmark of modernity. It might mean that the Normans engineered an Anglo-Saxon loss of faith in themselves as a nation or a race, and the Puritan liberal faith derived its characteristic attributes as a substitute. In its more secular form, the substitute for racial identity became the optimistic, future-oriented, American creed. This futurism was almost inevitable, since from the sub-political view from which it originated, full reconciliation with the past was unsolvable. They could not change the past, nor fully overcome their prejudice against aristocracy. They could not satisfy either extreme of total disengagement or total engagement as political beings. Consequently, their solution became the compromised, bourgeois solution best known as Americanism. Within the limits of this system of thought, there thus existed a rational basis for the repression of the memory of the Norman conquest, the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson, it seems, often decided in favor of a happy and optimistic interpretations of history over certain uncongenial truths. If one is going to seek pleasure and avoid pain like a good Anglo-American pragmatist, if one, as Bertrand Russell put it, is going to achieve the conquest of happiness, one had better not think too hard about the Norman conquest or its practical implications. In the face of the unchangeable historical injustice of the Norman conquest, forgetting was a kind of healing. Yet the ultimate historical consequence is that the entire trajectory of Anglo-American history is partly propelled from this psychosocial repression of the conquest. Through defeat, they lost belief in themselves as a race. This American regime of reason is, in part, the universalization of the problems of this people who never fully overcame the trauma of being defeated and conquered. Puritanical hang-ups that emerged from the experience of being a long-conquered people made America possible. America is the working out of the implications of the Anglo-Saxon ethnic defeat of 1066 on the stage of world history. Chapter break. The socio-biological basis of the tabula rasa. Back to main text. In The End of History and the Last Man, political thinker Francis Fukuyama posited the idea that liberal democracy may constitute the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the final form of human government, and as such constituted the end of history. That is, while earlier forms of government were characterized by grave defects and irrationalities that led to their eventual collapse, liberal democracy was arguably free from such fundamental internal contradictions. 1389. Biology remains the unreconciled contradiction of the political systems originating in modernity. The most significant philosophical basis for the consistent banishment of biology in modernity has been English philosopher John Locke's theory of the blank slate or tabula rasa. However, if the tabula rasa is untenable in light of the discoveries of sociobiology, then can sociobiology explain Locke's tabula rasa itself? The John Locke who penned two treatises of government 1690, and helped inspire parts of the United States Constitution, is the same John Locke who is responsible for the famous blank slate theory of human nature. This is not an accident or coincidence. If John Locke was a philosopher, and philosophy has had the ambition of reconciling all knowledge, then there must be some philosophic connection between his theory of the tabula rasa and his theory of liberal democracy. Locke believed that the government of a conqueror, imposed by force on the subdued, has no obligation upon them, and they have the right to have their yoke cast off, as soon as God shall give those under their subjection courage and opportunity to do it. 1390. Was this not encouragement to continue the hereditary struggle against the Norman yoke? After the failure of England's Puritan Revolution via the Restoration of 1660, this would imply that some Anglo-Saxons still wished for the overthrow of Norman-descended aristocrats who survived the attempted purge of 1649. In socio-biological perspective, the kinship basis for these conflicts is comprehensible. The biological bases of such behaviors are largely unconscious, and can appear irrational to a philosopher. Both Locke's individualism and his tabula rasa theory of human nature implicated the repression of seemingly irrational kinship-based interpretations of England's internal conflicts. For if Locke was wrong, the basis for an internal state of war could not be fully eradicated. Locke's clean slate was the cumulative effect of consistently banishing the Norman-Saxon conflict interpretation of English-speaking history by banishing biological factors. The tabula rasa expressed, on a philosophical level, the some aversion to Norman-Saxon conflict interpretations of the English Civil War. Far from being a chance phenomenon, the Lockean cover-up was almost the only viable political ideological solution. For if the Puritan Revolution originated in ethnic kinship conflict, and the source of conflict was restored in 1660, with the aristocracy surviving 1688, then the source of conflict could be unresolvable. America inherited the Lockean cover-up at its very foundations. While the North inherited the Anglo-Saxon side in the English Civil War, the South inherited the Norman side. The American revolutionaries needed the tabula rasa myth, in part, because each side could coherently justify both war against Britain and peace with one another, only through a systematic de-emphasis of biological factors. The internal peace that made the American Revolution did not hold, however, and the American Civil War repeated the pattern of the English Civil War. American optimism, built upon the modern, Lockean theory of human nature, was itself built upon a politically inspired desire to explain away the hereditary conflict that was the very impetus of revolution itself. This historical blind spot would become a grand tradition to be passed from generation to generation. The clean slate was the noble lie that provided the means of wiping away the entire barrage of complex problems raised by confronting the Norman-Saxon conflict, whereas modernity was supposed to be characterized by the enlightened belief that biology does not matter, and that ethnic conflict should be irrelevant. Rational socio-biological investigation shows that English-speaking modernity was at least partly catalyzed by ethnic conflict. This means even after a high degree of cultural assimilation, there remained a kinship basis for conflict. That the most influential liberal democracy was built upon a foundation of ethnic conflict is its most fundamental internal contradiction. One can see here how the nature-nurture debate is directly related to the socio-biological roots of liberal democracy. Locke's tabula rasa argument was really the great theoretical culmination of the Great Repression of the socio-biological basis of the Norman-Saxon conflict, which stands at the very foundation of political modernity. Biological kinship factors were selectively exorcised from rational political discussion precisely because these were the most problematic and politically subversive, building upon a discourse that rejected the kinship ethnic conflict interpretation of the English Civil War and using this to his advantage. Locke's arguments offered a self-consistent nurturist explanation and justification for the liberal, bourgeois state. In consequence, suppression of a fully biologized account of the Norman consequence upon England is an intellectual foundation of modern Western political rationalism. The entire edifice of the social project called America is built upon repression of its genesis out of the Norman-Saxon conflict. From this logical foundation of repression of biological factors arose, by implication, the script for the entire universal egalitarian crusade against racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. Egalitarian progress is only the progressive widening of this original Lockean apartheid between nature and nurture. In order for this enlightened regime to uphold its claims to be distinctly rational, this foundational contradiction clearly had to be dismissed. It follows from this nurturist view that all other ethnic conflicts in history, such as the cases of the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, or Nazi Germany, can be dismissed as the product of myth or falsehood. Fortunately, mankind has the assurance of the liberal Anglo-American view of history that the old problems at the root of these ethnic conflicts can be wiped clean. Every egalitarian liberation is simultaneously a repression of the ethnic tribal origin of egalitarianism. Every step up on the stairwell of egalitarian progress is a stomp down on its socio-biological foundation. The consistent progress of the egalitarian premise is thus, inversely, also a consistent suppression of its own socio-biological basis. Progress has come to mean the increase of ignorance about the ethnic origins of the conflicts that stimulated progress. Progress would thus appear to be like a race against knowledge of these biological factors, outrunning the Norman socio-biological reach, and thus outrunning self-enlightenment. Tracing the roots of this repression of biological factors still further leads to a medieval psychosocial repression. The denial of the Norman-Saxon roots of American democracy is only a continuation of the denial of Anglo-Saxon defeat by the Normans at Hastings. The trauma and humiliation of that defeat was agonizingly perpetuated for centuries upon centuries in the form of obedience and collaboration with the subjugators. Since it could not be undone, and had to be lived with as the very norm of political existence, it was ultimately denied, repressed, and interpreted away. Locke's tabula rasa provided an intellectual basis for claiming that Norman conquest did not matter. The clean slate intellectually justified wiping away the hereditary blemish of the conquest. Repression of the long-term historical significance of 1066 is what gave birth to the myth of America. The normalization of this political biological repression had world historical consequences in formulating the political norms of Anglo-Saxon liberal democracy. At the root of the denial of the significance of race in America is this psychosocial denial of the significance of the defeat of the Anglo-Saxon race in 1066. To assimilate American cultural values is to inherit the denial of the kinship ethnic dimensions of the Norman conquest and its legacy. The inability to fully face the race problems of America is the inheritance of the inability of the Anglo-Saxons to fully face themselves. Chapter break. The metaphysics of freedom. From Norman determinism back to main text. Locke's legacy is a kind of apartheid between the political and social on the one hand, and the biological on the other. The time has come to end the intellectual apartheid that has preserved the status quo of discrimination against biological factors. Sociobiology has helped to overcome the old boundaries between the social and the biological. The next great coming together is synthesis of sociobiology and politics, sociobiology. The convergence of politics, biology, and sociology has a very specific antagonism to the West's liberal democracies, for the confluence of these factors are exactly the ones that the Normans originally occupied. The modern separation of political, biological, and social powers broke up the archetypal monopoly represented by the Norman conquest. Synthesizing all these dimensions together simultaneously, one can grasp the roots of their modern disassociation. It is precisely the juxtaposition of the conquest and modernity that exposes the reigning, inherited prejudice to uncorrelate these correlations and disassociate these associations. This Anglo-Saxon tendency to sever modern events from their evolutionary origins could be considered a kind of national dissociative disorder. Resistance to history is as much a typical American characteristic as resistance to tyrants, which may help explain why so many Americans have never heard of the Norman conquest. Resistance to both is linked with the Lockean revulsion towards biological factors in human affairs, a seemingly congenital revulsion towards the notion of genetic determinism. All these resistances combined are linked to an Anglo-Saxon desire for freedom from the notion that the Norman conquest fundamentally determined the nature of Anglo-Saxon history. It is not true that sociobiology implies strict genetic determinism. As John Alcock has pointed out, one reason why anti-sociobiologists try to wrap sociobiology in the mantle of determinism is to suffocate the discipline by claiming that sociobiologists believe something that is demonstrably false. 1391. Sociobiology does not imply genetic determinism. It does imply an attempt to account for existing biological factors, along with cultural factors. Yet when the political factor is added to the equation of an analysis of the Norman conquering, there is an obvious element of political control that magnified the influence of both the genes and the culture of the conquerors. Control over the political opens possibilities of the most maximal genetically adaptive strategies. After all, one of the great, classic historically decisive examples of genetically adaptive among humans is the Norman destruction of the native Anglo-Saxon aristocracy in and after 1066. Yet this genocidal behavior was only the platform for the English caste system that followed. Control over the political is control over evolution. Jeffersonian principles implicated loss of control over biological evolution. The ultimate victory of freedom and equality was the victory of discrimination against the radical kin-selective behaviors epitomized by the Norman conquest. The idea of the Norman yoke fused notions of the laws of biological determinism with a kind of political determinism through bondage to Norman laws. In 1651, the year of the Anglo-Saxon Puritan victory in the English Civil War, prisoners who petitioned for liberation believed the law was the badge of the Norman bondage. Freedom from the Norman bondage, in their view, was inseparable from a desire to not be determined by political law. Freedom from the Norman yoke was inseparable from the Anglo-Saxon metaphysical self-conception as free people. The metaphysics of freedom were designed to drown out the metaphysics of conquest. Resistance to the Norman influence on modern democratic revolution in the English-speaking world is understandable. Admission of delayed historical reaction to the conquest means that not only did the subjugators directly master the Anglo-Saxon past, but that the Normans indirectly mastered their future. Fully coming to term with this anti-Norman reaction might mean admitting that the conquerors were as influential in forming Anglo-Saxon political identity as the Anglo-Saxons themselves. It is not hard to see why egalitarian revolutionaries would resent the idea that Anglo-Saxon democracy is what it is as old clay in the hands of Norman master sculptors, when it was precisely this Norman influence that they were trying to escape. The genealogy of anti-genealogy nurturism, and specifically American resistance to sociobiology, is rooted in resistance to this same idea that, even in their apparent victorious revolt, the Normans directly or indirectly determined the entire trajectory of Anglo-Saxon history. It would mean that, through the cunning of history, Norman genes hold American culture on a long historical leash. American cultural resistance to the very notion of genetic determinism originated, in part, from Anglo-Saxon resistance to being determined or controlled by Norman genes. In this case, political monopoly allowed not only the magnification, but also the literal ability to control and select Anglo-Saxon genes, i.e. through dispossessing, killing, or exiling the native aristocracy. The destruction of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy following the victory at Hastings was genetically adaptive, and only one aspect of the Norman kin selective strategy. Parasitic exploitation by Norman genes led to a revolt against obedience to the laws of hereditary authority. If the authority of the law served the interests of a Norman inclusive fitness strategy, then fighting for freedom against obedience to those laws was also freedom from political biological determinism. Hence, the Lockean rejection of genetic determinism is not separable from Lockean politics, and is traceable to overgeneralized Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism. The Lockean foundation of America is Anglo-Saxon resistance to idea that the Normans, in whatever complex ways, determined their socio-biological destiny. The Lockean tradition of Anglo-Saxon resistance to what is now called sociobiology is Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism. For this reason, the only way to fully escape the view that the Normans molded the political being of the Anglo-Saxons was the alternative self-understanding provided by individualism, whereby one could attempt to bypass the classical kinship polity model altogether, yet only by not conforming to the individualistic rules of this Anglo-Saxon system can one understand it. The enlightened self-interest of the Anglo-Saxon race was advanced through the rational nationalism of universal individualism. This is one reason why Anglo-Saxons implicitly believe they are ethnically superior to ethnocentrism. The view that they, like hobbits in the Shire, are simply natural democrats, and this has nothing to do with the Normans, is none other than an Anglo-Saxon fantasy. Anglo-Saxon freedom became associated with universalism through Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism. The alternative would be to admit that their very hunger for freedom was determined by the impact of the Norman mastery. What the Anglo-Saxon tradition loathes to admit is that they had not the freedom to choose the political environment that they were forced to adapt to. Without the freedom to choose collective political freedom, individual freedom evolved as an alternative, advancing democratic viewpoints among historians, and downplaying the Norman conquest as an example of the great man, or great Norman, view of history, are not fully separable if democracy itself evolved through a continuation of the fight at Hastings. After all, why would Anglo-Saxon historians emphasize the elite Norman genius for perpetuating political hereditary rule over them? Freedom from Norman determinism is freedom from the possibility that William the Conqueror may have been the single most influential individual in Anglo-Saxon history. The deepest Anglo-Saxon hatred for the Normans is rooted in recognition that history itself cannot be undone. The Anglo-Saxon metaphysics of freedom thus exposes a form of anti-intellectual stupidity behind modern democratic rationalism. Freedom from Norman determinism was freedom from a form of rational self-knowledge.